Everybody speaks English? It's okay? Okay, I'll do it in English then. Okay, let's start. So the session today is about TypeScript design patterns applied to SharePoint Framework and React. My name is Luis Valencia. I am from Colombia, but I'm living in Brussels right now. So I work at PwC Belgium. I am a senior solutions architect, and my job in PwC is to design solutions using Azure technology and SharePoint on premises and Office 365. That's my website and my blog. I have about 10 years of experience with SharePoint, 2 times MVP. I hope this one is the tier 1. Thanks to our sponsors, that's the reason we are here. I guess you all already have all the Wi-Fi connection. And let's get this started. What is this session about? This session is about showing you clean code, how to write clean code for SharePoint Framework and or for React. So what I'm going to show you does not only apply to SharePoint Framework, it applies only to React applications which are standalone. We are not going to see cool user interface here because there are a lot of bloggers already who write blog posts and do cool demos using cool web parts. What I'm going to show here is use code. We will see some demos, but don't expect that you're going to see cool user interface. You are going to see cool code, clean code. Some news. This was just tweeted this morning. So SharePoint Framework 1.6 is going to be released by the end of July, and it's going to be target for React 16. Please note that schedule and content is subject to change, but this was tweeted by Microsoft today. There is going to be SharePoint 2019 support. There is going to be the general availability for the dialog framework and for the graph and third-party API calls from SharePoint. Tenant-wide deployments for SharePoint framework extensions, which are currently in preview, and maybe other surprises that we can see. So in the beginning, I said that I'm not going to show really cool user interface web parts. For that, there are another bloggers. So Waldek Mastikars from Holland, Elio Struff, Chris O'Brien from the UK, Luis Manuich from Spain, Giuliano from Italy, and Adrian from Spain as well. They also have their own blogs showing really nice user interface, really nice web parts. What I'm going to show you is user code. I don't know if you noticed, but in the beginning, like 1 or 2 years ago when SharePoint Framework was released, Microsoft said that it was going to be possible to deploy package as libraries, not only web parts. So libraries that could be used from other package. But the truth is that it's not released yet. So if you can take a picture for this and vote. So this is the user voice for adding support for libraries. Because right now what you can do is to create web parts, package, deploy them to SharePoint, but there is not support for libraries. And what we want, there are like 300 votes for this feature, and what we want is to be able to deploy no user interface solutions. So only code that can be used from other packages like APIs. If I want something for you to learn on this, is this sentence. So how many of you have found code from others, and you wish to know where the guy lives, because it's really a pain. It's really a pain to find somebody else's code and that you don't know how it works. And apparently the code is bad written, but it still works. So always code as if the guy who ends up maintaining your code will be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. So that's the entire message of this session. Who of you are .NET developers in the past? So I think all of us come from .NET background. In .NET and in Java and in other language, it's very common to talk about design patterns. So in TypeScript is, I don't know, 2 or 3 years more or less. People think that it's only a user interface language, that is only for web parts, but it's not. You can also use TypeScript for Node.js, for backend applications, for APIs. So the Gang of 4 is 4 guys that they wrote a book in 1994, and it has been the holy grail of design patterns for other language. So this is a programming language agnostic, this book, but it has been applied to every programming language. What's a design pattern? So a design pattern is a repeatable solution for common problems in business applications. So every design pattern can be applied in different ways. So for example, I'm going to show you the singleton, which is the most basic one. You can write the singleton pattern in at least 3 or 4 different ways. So it's not just copy and paste. You have to read the design patterns and know where to apply it and know how to change it to your own needs. There are 23 design patterns. I know I'm not going to show them all because I will need an entire day probably. I'm going to show only 4, the most basic ones. But the idea is that you go out and read more about the subject so that you can use the other design patterns as well. The benefits. The benefits is if you are an architect or a solutions designer and you write documentation about software, if you write that you are using a design pattern, so other solutions architects, other developers will understand without actually reading the entire code. So it's very good because it's self-maintainable and it makes easy the communication between developers. I don't know if you already saw some blog posts from Waldeck, Elio, Stroff, but if you see those web parts that they write most of the code into 1 or 2 files. They don't split it, and it's okay because they are showing nice user interface things, but you can rewrite those using design patterns to make it more clean for the next developer to actually maintain it. This is the first category of design patterns. So singleton, I think everybody knows. A class which only a single instance can exist. If you don't use singleton in big projects with .NET, then you will have the risk that you are using the entire memory. Because, for example, in SharePoint Server on premises, there is the site collection, the SP web, the SP site. So you need to use those with memory in mind because they take a lot of memory when you use those objects. There is the abstract factory, the builder, and the factory method that we will see next. The object tool and prototype, which are not covered for this session. Okay. The easiest way to show the singleton is imagine an application where you need to use configuration properties. something like number of items per page, the timeout for a REST API call, and you need to use those settings from different web parts. So you don't want to instantiate the object, the configuration manager object every time. You want to use only one instance. So that's what I'm going to show you next. Can you guys see the code from here? Okay. So I have a configuration manager class with a static field, which is the instance. In the constructor, we can do everything we need. And then we have a static getInstant method. Here, we check if an instance of the object has been created already or not. If it has been created, it returns the existing instance. If not, then it creates a new one. Yeah? This is the most or the easiest of the design patterns. And there, then we have use some properties like number of items per page, max number of connections. This is exercise for the reader to actually get the data from the property back or from a SharePoint list, but you get the idea. If I want to use this from the web part itself, then in the constructor, I create a field, and then I use configuration manager.getInstance, and then I don't have to worry about if the object is created or not. So only once I get the instance, and then it can be used from multiple locations. So I do it in the constructor, and then I just can get the fields I need. If you have a project with, for example, 20, 40 web parts, and you do it like this, then you will save a lot of time afterwards. This is very simple. I am just showing the properties in the user interface. And that's it. Why did I show you before the user voice? Because this makes more sense if we can deploy it as a library package. Right now, it only works if it's a web part project. But it will make more sense if I can create a singleton, deploy it as a library, and then let the other web parts projects to use that singleton. So it will be an external dependency. Next. Let's talk about the abstract factory. Questions so far? No? So the abstract factory, it defines the interface of collections of factory methods without specifying concrete products. So what does that mean in plain English? It means that we can return any type of object which use one interface. So we don't return concrete objects, we return the interface of the object itself. So that's easy to show in code. Okay, so let's see. For example, you have a class customer with some properties, first name, last name, age, date of birth, whatever. Then you create that class. you create an interface with some methods, so insert customer, delete, find, update, and list customers. Then you implement that interface in many different ways. Let's suppose that you have a backend in SharePoint, but you also have a backend in one external CRM or in Azure Functions or in a custom API or things like that. So you implement the same methods returning the same object, but the data sources could be different. So for example, I only implemented here by hand the list customers of the JSON data source. So I'm going to assume that it's connecting to a REST API to get the list of customers. And in SharePoint, I have the same. So an exercise to the reader, as I said before, is actually to get the items from a list. What I want to show you is how easy it is to actually change the data source, and the person or the developer who is actually writing the code doesn't need to know what type of data is being returned or where is it coming from. So in the web part, I have a method called setDIO, where I get the data source, which is just a field on the user interface. So I'm going to show you. You can actually see I created two possible data sources, SharePoint and JSON. And basically, I can select SharePoint JSON. You can extend this to select other external CRMs, and not only with customers, with any type of object or entity that you need. So if I show the component and I go to this method, setDIO, here you see DAO factory dot get DAO factory, and the parameter is the data source that I selected. Yeah. Then it gets the instance of the type of the DIO that I need. And then if you see one line below, this dot customer DAO dot list customers, I don't have any logic here to see if the data is coming from SharePoint or from JSON or from any data source. So basically, the user interface, the web part itself, is transparent of the data source. Yeah. So if I change, for example, here, SharePoint JSON, so it changed the data automatically. So if you do the exercise to implement the data access logics to get the list of customers either from a CRM, from Azure Functions, or from SharePoint itself, then you can use the same web part to get data from different data sources on the same page, which is nice if you are going to do integration between different systems. Questions about this one? No. Okay. The builder. The builder is a pattern to build complex objects out of single objects. So what I'm going to show next is how to create a meal out of something to drink and something to eat. So we have drinks, we have burgers, and then we are going to see how we can build a complex object with the meal, the entire food, to construct a complex object. So this is the builder pattern. Imagine, I've seen this in some companies. They use the intranet to show the menu in the restaurant, for example. So they create lists on SharePoint with the entire meal in the title, something like Coke, burger, whatever, and the price. But in this way, you could create different lists. One list for the beverage, one list for the burgers, another list for the, I don't know, pastas, for example. And then you can create like package, like the McDonald's menu or whatever. Huh? I have it here. The builder. So first, the models. We have an item. An item has the name, has a way to be packaged, because it could be a bottle or a wrap. So we have a packing interface, and we have a price. If we check the packing interface, it's just a method which returns the name of the packing. If we check, for example, the bottle, you will see here that implements e-packing, and here we return that this is a bottle. We can also check the wrapper. It also implements the same interface, but return that it's a wrapper. I'm using the entire code written by hand, but the same could be done using SharePoint list or any data source. Then, if we want to get some specific objects, for example, the Coke, you can say that Coke extends cold drink, and then I assign a price to it, and I assign a name. The same with Pepsi. If we are going to check the burgers, for example, chicken burger, you will see it returns a price and the name. And you see that this one extends from burger, which I didn't show before, so I will show it. The burger is an abstract class. An abstract class means that you need to implement the abstract methods from it. So you see that name is abstract, but packing is not abstract, because we know that the burger use wrapper, and if we check the cold drink, we know that the packing is a bottle. Then we go to the meal itself, which is this one. And what I want you to see here is we create a private object of type of an array of items. So it's not a concrete type of burgers, not a concrete type of beverage, it's item. And because all the Cola, Pepsi, the burgers, they implement the same interface, then you don't need to worry about the object itself. If they all implement the same interface, then that means that you can actually add objects of different types that implement the interface to the array. So we receive an item here, and we just push it to the array. Then we get the cost that's just going through the array for getting the cost of the meal, and just show items method just to print which is in the meal itself plus the price at the end. And finally, the meal builder. So here is where I say, so vegetarian meal is a vegetarian burger plus Coke. Doesn't make any sense, I know, but for the sample. And non-vegetarian meal is a chicken burger and Coke. Yeah? And as you can see, I didn't have to add an item like this. I added the specific type. and because this one receives an item, then it doesn't care which type you send to as parameter. Meal builder, okay. And now, if we check the most important part, which is the object, the component, I mean. So here in the constructor, we create a meal builder object. We set a meal. We send which type of meal as a parameter. So let me show you in the demo. Builder. Welcome to Luis. So here you can select if you want a vegetarian or not vegetarian, and depending on what you select, it automatically gets the items from the data source, which in this case are hard-coded, but you can do it with SharePoint. And what I want to show here is the set meal method. The set meal the first time will be undefined for this specific sample. So for me the default one is the vegetarian meal, but I could use other types. So if its selection is 0, so I prepare this one. If its selection is 1, this one. And at the end I set the state, which is just a string to show this text. So basically, we are creating complex objects out of single ones. In that way, we can hide the complexity of the complex objects in a way that you can actually maintain easier the next time you need to do changes on this type of code. In the next one, UML. So I have a UML diagram for this one, which is the factory method, and the example I'm going to show is how can you use the same web part to actually show items from different lists. So I created a list, generic list, and another list, announcements that we all know. And how can we use the same web part for rendering items for multiple lists and be sure that the items returned are of a specific type? I don't know if you checked samples from other bloggers, but usually when they render items, they don't say if it's a type announcement or type news. So what I'm going to do is to show this in action. Factory method. So we have a folder for the models where our POCOs live. So everybody knows what's a POCO. Plain old CLR object. So they are just classes with no logic in it, which are from a real world object. So for example, we have a list item, so we have ID, title, modifier, created. So all these fields come from SharePoint, but this is the generic list item. We know that when we create a new list in SharePoint, we have at least these fields. They are mandatory. We cannot delete these fields. But we can also have, for example, the iAnnouncement list item. As you can see, it extends the one I just showed with two other fields. So basically, I'm saving lines of code here because I didn't have to add created by modified by to the same interface, and the same applies for eDirectory, news list item, etc. Then we create an interface called iFactory, and this basically means that every data source that we use should implement the method getItems with these parameters, which is basically the HTTP client, which is the standard SharePoint Framework HTTP client, the URL of the site, and the list name. And it will return, and this is very important, a promise of any type of object. That's important because we need to do a casting later to convert what we return to the object we need. Then we have the eListItem interface, which is the complex one. So here we say, if we get a list, a generic list, then make an HTTP get call to the list, so get by title, and get me these fields. As you can see, this is a standard call. And in the last, then, when everything is returned, we map the items here. Ah, sorry. Wait. Sorry. So you didn't see from the beginning, I think. Okay, so I'm going to show the eListItem first, which was already in the diagram. So basically we have ID, title, modified, created. Then we have the iAnnouncement. So as you can see, it extends the eListItem, but I don't have to put the ID, the created again, created by, modified by. The same with directory, list. Then you can create one interface for every type of list you have. I like to work this way because these objects are strongly typed. So instead of working with list items, you are working with announcements, you are working with customers, you are working with, I don't know, jobs, list, opportunities. So you can actually use always with IntelliSense dot, and it will get the field you need. So again, this was on the diagram. So this is the interface getItems that we need to implement with the any. I will show you why the any in a minute here. So here is the complex logic. So the listItem factory implements that interface I just showed. And in the switch, so we have a switch for every different value. So for the generic list, we make a get to the list name, and we get the fields we need here. And when the value is returned, you see here, it should return a list item, but it's not returning the specific list. So here I'm doing a mapping of what the rest call returns to the object itself. If you want to see, for example, announcements. In announcements, so it's more clear, I'm getting all the items, all the value, all the fields to that specific type. And why does this work? Because if you see the signature of the method is any type. It's an array of any type of object, right? Now the funny part is actually the TSX. But I need to show something first. So the state. If you know React, you know that you always have props and a state, and in the state is what you actually want to render on the user interface, which comes from a data source, right? So in this ifactory method state, I have one sub-state to hold the data that is coming depending on the list selected. So if it comes from the announcement, then it will fill this one, iDetails announcement list item state. The name is really long. Why? I have the specific interfaces below. So if it's a generic list, we use the base class, which is not extending from any interface. If it's an announcement list, then we use the specific announcement list item interface, right? It seems complex, but at the end, when you're actually using this as a developer, it's easier to read from the user interface point of view. So in many companies, some people are the backend developers, others are the front-end developers. So this is a perfect example where you can have a backend developer and another guy, which is the user interface expert, only using the methods provided by the backend developer. So let's see. Okay, this is the most important method in the entire component. Basically, this method is called from the constructor, and it's also called when I select a different list or a different data source. What it does is it creates a list item factory. Then with that factory, we get the items. So you will see here that the tier parameter is actually the list name of that interface. Then if you see the promise here, you will see that it returns any type. So an object of any type. So it can be a generic list, it can be a announcements list, it can be a news list. And here is the case thing that I talked about earlier, because we know that it will return an array of any type. Then I make a conversion of what it gets here to the specific type I need, right? So in this moment, we already have our data in the state. I mean, in memory, not in the state. And here, you see this dot set state. So everybody knows in React, we use the set state to actually get the value of the state, and then it will be rendered automatically every time the state changes. And you will see this specific part. Basically, we are telling React to render or to set the state dynamically depending on the selected list, right? So the key part here, if I show again the state, you see details list item, details new list item state, details directory list. So basically, we are creating where we are telling a SharePoint framework to set the state dynamically depending on the selected list. And the cool part of this demo also is the columns. For this demo, I'm using Office UI Fabric. So I think I have somewhere this one, the details list from Office UI Fabric React. And this library has a method called build columns. So basically it means that it will create the columns dynamically also, depending on the selected data source. So let's see this in action. Okay, this is the local workbench, but for this one I want to show the actual SharePoint workbench. So the factory method, so here is rendering items from the generic list. So you will see the fields, but I can actually select other lists, for example, announcements, and it will render the columns from the announcement list. So the same web part is useful for rendering items from different web parts, and the items are strongly typed. So it's not just list items by themselves, it's either announcement, news, or whatever. So I can use this, it's not implemented here, but I can use this to render, I don't know, for example, news, events, and things like that, but using the same fields like start date, end date, things like that. Questions about the factory method? So there are other design patterns also. So the structural design patterns is all about class and object composition. If you keep an eye on my blog, I am trying to create an example of every single design pattern and how to apply it to SharePoint framework and to React applications. There is also the behavior design patterns, and that's more about objects communication, right? So if you come from a .NET background, maybe you have seen the observer pattern, and the observer pattern is applied by C# using delegates. So sometimes, because this the original book was written in 1994, sometimes the creators of the language itself, they create a way for us to use the design pattern under the covers. So if we ever use events on .NET or ASP.NET, that's the observer pattern. So we don't have to worry about this. And it's possible that in TypeScript some of these are not useful, and some of these are not implemented by the language anymore. My GitHub repo. So basically this is a fork of the SharePoint framework, the official repository. I already submitted a pull request, so if they approve it, then it will be included in the official Office PMP samples package. And finally, as an end, solid principles. Who of you have heard of solid? 2 persons. So I have a good story about this. 5 years ago, I went to an interview for some place in Holland, I think it was. And after 3 or 4 questions, they asked me about, do you know solid principles? I had no idea what was it. The interview just went wrong. I didn't pass for that job. Then I started to study about it. And the thing is, solid principle is about how to write the classes themselves in a clean way. The first one is the most easy one, I think the easiest one, the single responsibility pattern, because maybe we already use it and we don't know it. if we create a class and that class has only one reason to change, it only has one behavior to implement, so we are using solid principles, well, at least the S of the single responsibility, right? So my next step during the next coming weeks is to write blog posts about how to use these solid principles in SharePoint framework. Why? I think it's important for us that we write clean code, that we write code that everybody else can understand and can maintain later. Because people, when they come to SharePoint framework for the first time, they think, oh, it's very cool, you are doing cool web parts with nice user interface. But it's not about writing 300 lines of code on the same Typescript file. So basically, my message to you is, let's split those files with specific behaviors, specific responsibilities, and let's write clean code so that we don't get the psychopath from the first slide, right? And at the end, I don't know if everybody took a picture, so please vote for this user voice, because if Microsoft implements the possibility that for us to create SharePoint framework libraries, then all this makes more sense. Why? Because at this moment, if we want to use these design patterns, we have to use them in the same project where the web parts are deployed, right? And thank you. Questions, please. Follow my blog, follow my Twitter, then I will post every time I create a new blog, every 2 weeks, for example, about new design patterns. Thank you.